Fortunino Matania was born in Naples, Italy in 1881, the son of the successful painter and illustrator Edoardo Matania. In his youth, Fortunino studied and worked in his father's studio, and to say he was a prodigy would be something of an understatement. By the age of 14, he was already assisting his father in the production of illustrations for any number of books and magazines. His precocious talent led to him being commissioned in his own right by L'Illustrazione Italiana, which had been one of his father's clients, and which had now become a regular source of income for Fortunino too. He created many illustrations for the magazine between 1895 and 1902, making his entry into commercial activity a particularly smooth one. Naturally enough, a combination of his own innate ability and having been able to learn directly from his father meant that Matania could bypass the usual requirement for formal study at an art school. And in 1902, at the age of only 19, he was invited to London, initially to provide illustrations celebrating the coronation of Edward VII for the Graphic magazine. This remarkably prestigious high-profile commission led immediately to more work for the Graphic, and he stayed with them as a staff artist for the next couple of years. Now resident in London in 1904, Matania left the Graphic at the age of 23 to join the rival magazine The Sphere, where he quickly became their leading staff artist. In the following year he married Alvera de Gennario, and the couple would go on to produce a son and daughter. In his time at the Sphere he covered a wide range of events, pageants and state occasions, and was also creating a considerable number of illustrations of major theatrical and operatic productions taking place in the capital. And in 1910 he was the natural choice to record the funeral of Edward VII, although not, it seemed, the subsequent coronation of his son George V. Nevertheless, he did create quite a few others of the new monarch on various occasions at this time. All Matania's illustrations to date were invariably printed in monochrome halftone, and he usually painted his illustrations with that process in mind. And in addition to the washes of gouache which were the basis of his images, he enhanced some areas with black ink and other mediums such as graphite, and made sparing but telling use of opaque white to create highlights and give the images considerable depth. This worked very much to the advantage of his printed work, which reproduced with much crisper definition than that of some of his British contemporaries working in magazines. There were a small number of colour originals created by Matania at this time, even if they were destined for reproduction in monochrome. But most of his colour work was produced in his equally successful career as an artist, and away from the demands of commercial publishing deadlines, he generally favoured the use of oils on canvas. But although monochrome would continue to be by far the dominant means of reproduction of his work, on occasion the Sphere did actually reproduce some of his scenes in full colour. And the original painted images constituted a financial bonus for Matania, as they were far more likely to be sold subsequently to collectors. By all accounts, Matania spent considerable amounts of his time travelling to various locations, both in and outside Britain, to create sketches and studies which would inform the accuracy of the final painted image. Of course, this wasn't true of the illustrations he produced for the Sphere to record and lament the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. But you would not have known it from the remarkable authority of his images about the tragic event. And the illustrations he created were a mix of the dramatic and the more diagrammatic and journalistic in order to bring this tragedy to visual life for the readers of the magazine. But when the Great War began in 1914, Matania immediately became a war artist for the British Ministry of Propaganda, and he travelled to the front on several occasions to make first-hand close-quarter studies and sketches with his own life seriously at risk. The authenticity of his pictures was nothing short of incredible, and in pursuit of such authenticity, when actual location work wasn't a logistical possibility, for example when the battle had already taken place, some of the illustrations were also created from verbal accounts by soldiers who had been wounded and returned to Britain to convalesce. Apparently Matania would work somewhat like a police artist, sketching while questioning the soldiers about specific details in order to attain maximum plausibility. Many of his images of the war were also published in the Sphere, and for British civilians they constituted the most convincing and up-to-date visual record of the successes and failures of the troops, as well as the appalling conditions they endured on behalf of those back home. Although almost exclusively journalistic in nature, on occasion they were not entirely devoid of sentimentality, such as this image of a soldier bidding farewell to his fatally wounded horse, manifestly designed to bring a tear to the eye of the viewer. And there was even a small amount of humour, such as this illustration of a young French or Belgian boy defiantly sticking his tongue out at a passing German officer. Despite the official nature of much of his wartime work, Mantegna wasn't being totally altruistic, and certainly not averse to profiting from it. And in 1916, even as the war still raged across Europe, he published a portfolio titled "With the British Army on the Western Front", 12 signed artist proofs taken from his wartime illustrations for the Sphere. Once the war was over, Mantegna returned to more light-hearted material for magazines and expanded his client base with commissions from others, including the Illustrated London News. And increasingly he was having his illustrations published across continental Europe and in the USA. The fact that he was also selling his originals as well as creating both oils and watercolours as art, which fetched high prices from collectors, meant that he had become extremely wealthy. In 1920 he was one of a group of 20 successful illustrators to be featured in a series of profiles published by Percy V. Bradshaw, titled The Art of the Illustrator. The books were intended to give insight into the working methods of the chosen subjects, but they were not entirely honest in their portrayals of the progressive stages of the images created. Because a lot of the work he was commissioned to produce and a good proportion of his art was historically or mythologically themed, Mantegna felt obliged to be as accurate as possible in his portrayals, and he filled his cavernous London studio with furniture, props, costumes and relics of all kinds to inform the work he produced. He also kept a sizable library of historical reference books, which he turned to with great frequency for research material. And similarly, in his pursuit of authenticity and plausibility, he worked whenever possible from posed life models, including his wife, whose services he used frequently for the portrayal of comely female characters. Among the many outcomes an illustrator might be asked to work for, magazines have always been notoriously ungenerous in terms of deadlines. So the demands made on artists such as Mantegna were particularly unforgiving, and despite the complexity and need for authenticity in his work, he also had to be able to turn images round frequently within a few days of receiving the commission. In 1929 his father died, but that was also the year a new magazine, Britannia and Eve, was launched, and from the first issue onwards he not only created many scenes of ancient history, but also wrote the text for many of the featured articles. It didn't escape anyone's attention at the time that a sizable proportion of the ancient and classical historical imagery he created for the magazine featured significant levels of bare female flesh and even voluptuous nudity. This was highly unusual in straight-laced Britain at the time, but was justified as being historically accurate, and the images were never censored. Even so, the titillating nature of some of Mantegna's women must have helped to shift more copies of the magazine than it otherwise might have. The incredible volume of illustrations he created for this magazine evoked dramatic scenes spanning millennia, from ancient Egypt through to medieval Europe, and the sheer logistics of assembling such scenes with the authority and pictorial satisfaction Mantegna brought to bear, not to mention the speed with which he turned them around, speaks volumes about the enviable qualities of his work ethic and talent. And although monochrome reproduction continued to be the most frequent outcome for his published work, in the second half of the 1920s the Sphere was also regularly publishing his illustrations in full colour, giving them increased appeal for their readership. In 1933, Mantegna was commissioned to produce narrative illustrations for a series of Edgar Rice Burroughs' science fantasy tale, Pirates of Venus, and it proved popular enough to lead to more of a similar nature for Burroughs' Lost on Venus. Both these were created entirely in tonal monochrome, but they were nevertheless highly successful outings into the realms of fantasy, even if Burroughs' concept of life on other planets was remarkably similar to life on ancient Earth, with a few alien creatures thrown in. But he approached the work with the same eye for detail and credibility of characters, whether human or otherwise, exactly as he had with his historical work. And a year or so later he created another series of science fiction images for the Passing Show magazine, to accompany a serialization of When Worlds Collide, a novel co-written by Edward Balmer and Philip Wiley, which had originally been published in the Blue Book Pulp magazine. These were far more technology-based and credible than the near-naked adventures of Burroughs. Most of these were manifestly drawn and printed as monochrome, but there were also a couple of images using limited colour, and whether they were printed that way I really couldn't say. He was never particularly enthusiastic about the idea of commissions in advertising, but on occasion he did work on some commercial campaigns, including posters for the prestigious clothing company Burberry, and some particularly impressive paintings for the LMS Railway depicting scenes of holiday makers in the northwestern coastal resorts Blackpool and Southport. Unsurprisingly, shapely females were once more well to the fore in his compositions. In 1937, following the abdication of his brother Edward VIII, George VI was crowned King of England, and of course Matania was chosen to provide illustrations for a commemorative edition of the Tatler magazine. During World War II, Matania once more returned to images of battle, although not with the same prodigious volume as those he created in the earlier conflict. I've been unable to discover if he actually went to some locations, such as the rescue at Dunkirk, to create his sketches, but it's worth noting he was by this time already in his 60s and possibly disinclined to repeat his performance from the First War. Nevertheless, whether they were observed or the work of imagination, the results were completely credible in every case. And when it was over, he commemorated the Allies' victory with this rousing patriotic colour painting of the victorious Allied forces. Although he continued to be extremely successful in the post-war years as a painter, the general lack of pictorial evidence suggests his magazine illustration commissions had become considerably less frequent. Matania's wife died in 1952 after 47 years of marriage, and this may have been at least one reason why he became less prolific. But it's equally likely that now 70 years old, he had simply made more than enough money and no longer had much interest in commercial work. Among his painted work of the decade was a commission to record the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, and in the same time frame, although I can't state a specific year, he also produced some very credible religious art, with oil paintings depicting various moments in the life of Jesus Christ. And despite having just turned 80 years old, in 1962 he did have some colour historical images reproduced in the newly established educational magazine Look and Learn. But a year later, in 1963, he died in London at the age of 81. Fortunino Matania's spectacularly successful career as an illustrator and artist spanned a remarkable 7 decades, and I don't think it would be overstating the case to argue that he was the greatest representational illustrator working in Britain at any time during the 20th century. Apparently he was disdainful of the many artistic isms and illustrative fashions which sprang up and just as quickly disappeared during his lifetime. And like his father before him, he never wavered in his aim to record actuality as dramatically but also as authentically as he could, in order to bring the subject to plausible life for the viewer. And I can think of nobody, in Europe at least, who did so with the same level of skill, creativity and popular success.